Imagine your phone vibrates. Not a text, not a notification, but a call from an unknown number. You answer, and the voice on the other end is a low melodic baritone that knows exactly what you're wearing. He asks you a simple question: what scares you more, the knife at your throat or the hand on your waist? This is the world Sidney Prescott is trapped in, where desire and death are the same thing. If you're brave enough to stay on the line, subscribe and like this video. Tell us which city you're tuning in from so we know exactly where the call is coming from. Attendance is mandatory. The rain didn't just fall over Woodsboro, it wept, coating the sprawling Becker estate in a shimmering obsidian glaze. Inside, Casey Becker moved through the silent house with the practiced grace of a woman who knew she was being watched, even if she told herself she was alone. The air was thick with the scent of expensive vanilla candles and the sharp, crisp aroma of a chilled Chardonnay. She adjusted the belt of her silk robe, the fabric a cool, sliding caress against her skin that felt almost like an intrusion in the quiet. She shouldn't have been nervous. Her parents were out for the night, leaving her in a glass-walled fortress of modern architecture and isolation. Yet, every time she caught her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, she lingered a second too long, wondering if the darkness outside was looking back. The phone didn't ring so much as it purred, a low, melodic chime that broke the silence like a secret whispered in a confessional. Casey picked it up on the second beat, her fingers tracing the smooth surface of the receiver. "Hello?" she breathed, her voice a soft tremor that she hoped sounded more like an invitation than an inquiry. "You sound breathless, Casey," a voice replied. It was a baritone like velvet stretched over gravel, deep, intimate, and dangerously smooth. It wasn't the voice of a prankster, it was the voice of a man who spent his nights thinking of her. "Do I know you?" Casey asked, a small playful smile tugging at her lips. She leaned against the kitchen island, the cold marble grounding her as a flush crept up her neck. "Not yet," the voice whispered. "But I know the way you look when you're alone. I know the way you touch your hair when you think nobody is watching. It's exquisite." The flirtation was a sharp blade wrapped in silk. Casey felt a sudden, electric heat radiate through her chest. It was wrong, terrifying even, but there was a magnetic pull to the intimacy of his tone. He spoke to her as if they were already lovers, sharing a private joke in a room full of people. "You're very bold for a stranger," she countered, her heart beginning to hammer a rhythmic, frantic beat against her ribs. She moved toward the window, her eyes searching the shadows of the garden. "What is it you want?" "I want to know what scares you, Casey," he said, and she could almost hear the smirk in his voice. "But more than that. I want to know what you desire when the lights go out. Is it the safety of the known? Or is it the thrill of the predator at the door?" The air in the kitchen felt suddenly thin. Casey's hand moved instinctively to the collar of her robe, pulling it tighter, though her body felt unnervingly alive under the scrutiny of his words. The soap opera drama of the moment was peaking. The tension was no longer just about a phone call. It was about the power he held over her senses. "I think you should hang up now," she said, though she made no move to pull the phone away. "I think you like the way my voice feels in your ear," he replied, his tone shifting. The playfulness vanished, replaced by a cold, possessive intensity. "I like it when you're afraid, Casey. It makes your skin look like porcelain. It makes you look ready." The shift was a physical blow. Casey's gaze locked onto the patio doors. A movement, a flicker of white against the black trees. A mask. Pale, distorted, and frozen in a silent, eternal shriek. "Who are you?" she gasped, her voice finally breaking. "I'm the secret you didn't know you were keeping," the voice whispered, now sounding as if it were coming from right outside the glass. "And tonight, Casey, the secret is out." The line went dead, leaving only the sound of the rain and her own ragged breathing. She turned to run, the silk of her robe catching on the corner of the table, a sudden violent snag that mirrored the terror clawing at her throat. She didn't see the shadow detach itself from the hallway. She only felt the presence, the heat of another body, the cold steel of a blade, and the final devastating whisper against her ear before the world dissolved into a cacophony of shattered glass and stilled breath. Woodsboro's peace was dead. And Casey Becker was the first sacrifice on the altar of a very private, very lethal obsession. The morning after Casey Becker's body was found, strung up like a macabre art installation against the backdrop of her parents' manicured lawn, Woodsboro didn't just wake up, it curdled. The air in the hallways of Woodsboro High was thick, not with grief, but with a voyeuristic electricity. It was the kind of atmosphere found in the best daytime dramas, high stakes, hushed whispers, and the predatory gleam of news cameras waiting at the gates. Sydney Prescott moved through the corridor like a ghost haunting her own life. Every look from a classmate felt like a finger tracing the scar of her mother's murder a year prior. To the town, Sydney was a tragic heroine. To herself, she was a ticking clock. She found sanctuary in the student lounge, a dimly lit corner where the sun struggled to penetrate the heavy velvet curtains. She wasn't alone for long. The heavy rhythmic thud of biker boots announced Billy Loomis before he even rounded the corner. Billy didn't just enter a room, he occupied it. He was handsome in a way that felt dangerous, all sharp jawlines, dark, brooding eyes, and a leather jacket that smelled of expensive tobacco and rain. He slid into the booth across from Sydney, his presence immediately narrowing the world down to just the two of them. "You're shaking, Sid," he said, his voice a low, melodic vibration. He didn't reach for her hand immediately. He watched her, his gaze lingering on the pulse point at her throat. It was a look of intense, almost clinical fascination. "Everyone is shaking, Billy." "Casey is, she's gone," Sydney replied, her voice brittle. She hugged her sweater closer, the wool scratchy against her skin. "It's happening again. The police, the questions. The way people look at me like I'm the one who brought the monster to town." Billy leaned forward, the wood of the table creaking under his weight. "Maybe they're just jealous," he whispered, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Jealous of the way tragedy makes you look. It gives you an edge, Sydney. A darkness that most people are too boring to possess." It was a classic Billy comment, disturbing yet inexplicably magnetic. Their relationship had always been a tug-of-war between comfort and a strange, erotic tension. He pushed for a physical closeness that Sydney felt she couldn't give, not while the memory of her mother's cold body still lived in her fingertips. "That's a horrible thing to say," she breathed, though she didn't look away. "Is it?" Billy's hand finally moved, sliding across the table. He didn't grab her, he let his fingertips graze the underside of her wrist, a slow, deliberate motion that sent a jolt of unwanted heat through her. "Or is it just the truth? We've been stuck in this loop for a year, Sid. You're holding your breath, waiting for the floor to drop. Well, the floor just dropped. Stop fighting it." He stood up and walked around the booth, sliding in next to her. The space was cramped, forcing their thighs to press together. Sydney could feel the heat radiating from him, an intensity that felt less like a hug and more like a siege. He leaned in, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You're so guarded," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "Like a prize behind glass. Don't you ever just want to break it? To feel something that isn't sadness?" His hand moved to the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the hairline with a possessive rhythm. It was a moment of pure soap opera suspense, the girl who survived, and the boy who might be her savior or her undoing. The ambiguity of his intent was a physical weight. Did he love her, or was he just obsessed with the version of her that was broken? "I have to go to class," Sydney whispered, though she didn't move. Her body was betraying her, responding to the raw masculine energy he projected even as her mind screamed for distance. "Class is cancelled, Sid. The whole town is under a shadow," Billy said, his voice dropping to a predatory hum. "Come over tonight. My dad is out. We can talk. Truly talk. No more secrets." The word secrets hung in the air, heavy and poisoned. Before she could answer, the bell rang, a shrill, violent sound that shattered the intimacy. Billy pulled back, a slow, enigmatic smirk spreading across his face. He tapped 2 fingers against his heart and walked away, leaving Sydney breathless and unervingly cold in his absence. That night, the Prescott house felt larger than usual. Her father was away on business, leaving Sydney alone with the shadows. She sat at her vanity, brushing her hair with mechanical strokes. 1, 2, 3. The phone rang. She picked it up, expecting Billy. Expecting that low, velvet voice to apologize for being so intense in the lounge. "Hello?" Silence. Only the sound of heavy, rhythmic breathing that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. "Billy? Is that you?" "Billy is such a tame choice, Sydney," the voice replied. It wasn't Billy's. It was the voice from the news reports, the one that had whispered to Casey Becker before the end. It was distorted, yet strangely intimate, as if the speaker were sitting right on the edge of her bed. "Who is this?" Sydney's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood up, her eyes darting to the window. "I'm the one who sees what Billy doesn't," the voice whispered. You let him into your bed, or at least you let him try. But you won't let him into your secrets. You won't tell him about the dreams you have, will you, Sydney? The ones where the blood feels like silk. Sydney froze. The caller knew things that hadn't been shared, private thoughts she hadn't even whispered to a diary. Leave me alone, she choked out. I can't do that, Ghostface replied, his tone shifting into something almost mournful. We're just getting started. You're the star of the show, Sydney. And every star needs a leading man. Tell me, is it Billy? Or is it someone who actually knows how to handle a girl with so much history? Sydney slammed the phone down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She ran to the window to lock it, but as she reached for the latch, she saw it. Down in the garden, standing perfectly still under the pale glow of the moon, was the white mask. It wasn't a hallucination. It was a witness. The figure tilted its head, a slow, mocking gesture of recognition, before melting back into the darkness of the trees. Sydney pulled the curtains shut, her hands trembling so violently she could barely grip the fabric. The weight of the ghost light was no longer a metaphor. It was a presence. And it was inside the gates. The halls of Woodsboro High had transformed into a gauntlet of whispers. If Chapter 1 was the shock and Chapter 2 was the grief, Chapter 3 was the slow, agonizing burn of paranoia. For Sydney Prescott, the world had become a series of frames, moments where she was either the victim, the suspect, or the prize. The soap opera of her life had shifted into a darker season, where every lingering look from a classmate felt like a hidden blade. She found herself in the school library, tucked away in the back stacks where the scent of aging paper and floor wax offered a temporary sterile peace. But peace was an illusion. The air felt heavy, charged with a static tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. You're hiding again, Sydney. The voice didn't come from a phone this time. It was Billy. He appeared from between the rows of encyclopedias, his silhouette cutting a sharp, dark figure against the dusty sunlight. He didn't stay at a distance. He moved into her space, his presence an overwhelming mixture of comfort and threat. He placed a hand on the shelf behind her head, effectively pinning her between the knowledge of the past and the danger of the present. I'm not hiding, Billy. I'm thinking, Sydney said, her voice barely a whisper. Thinking about the masked man in your garden? Or thinking about why I was late getting to your house last night? Billy's eyes were intense, searching hers with a ferocity that felt almost predatory. He leaned closer, the scent of his leather jacket, musk and a hint of something metallic, filling her senses. His other hand reached out, his thumb slowly tracing the line of her lower lip. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, yet there was a possessiveness to it that made Sydney's breath hitch. You're starting to look at me like the police look at a crime scene, Sid. Don't. It doesn't suit you. The caller. He knew things, Billy. Private things, she stammered, her heart racing not just from fear, but from the confusing electric pull he had over her. He mentioned my mother. He mentioned us. Billy's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew hungrier. Maybe he just sees what I see. A girl who is desperate to feel something other than the ghost of Maureen Prescott. He leaned down, his lips ghosting over her forehead, then her temple. I'm the only one who knows the real you, Sydney. The one you keep locked away. Why are you so afraid to let me in? The ambiguity was agonizing. Was he her protector, or was he grooming her for a final devastating betrayal? Before she could answer, the library's silence was shattered by the high-pitched rhythmic vibration of her phone on the wooden table. Both of them looked at it as if it were a live grenade. Billy reached for it first, his fingers brushing hers in a brief, searing contact. He looked at the screen, unknown number, and handed it to her with a slow, challenging smile. Answer it, Sydney. Let's see what the ghost has to say today. Sydney took the phone, her hand trembling. She pressed it to her ear, but she didn't move away from Billy. She stayed trapped in his shadow, his heat radiating against her front while the cold voice of the killer filled her head. Is he touching you right now, Sydney? The voice whispered. It was louder this time, more resonant. Can you feel his heart beating? Or is it just the sound of a lie being told? Sydney's eyes locked onto Billy's. He was watching her with an unnerving stillness, his hand still resting on the shelf above her. What do you want? Sydney choked out. I want to remind you of the family trade, Ghostface replied, a dark chuckle vibrating through the line. Your mother had a talent for secrets, didn't she? She knew how to use desire to get what she wanted. She let men in, Sydney. So many men. And look where it got her. You're just like her, aren't you? You crave the danger. You like the way Billy looks at you when he thinks he owns you. The killer wasn't just threatening her life, he was stripping away her dignity, exposing the raw, messy layers of her grief and her burgeoning sexuality. He was turning her own body against her, suggesting that her attraction to Billy was a symptom of the same shame that had allegedly defined her mother. You don't know anything about me, she hissed into the receiver. I know that Billy has a temper, the voice countered. I know that Stu Macker watches you when you're in the locker room. And I know that tonight, at the party, the masks are going to stay on, but the clothes are coming off. Who will you choose to trust when the lights go out, Sydney? The boy who wants to possess you, or the man who wants to end you? Or are they the same person? The line went dead. Sydney felt a wave of nausea. She looked up at Billy, who was still looming over her. What did he say? Billy asked, his voice low and demanding. He said everyone is watching, Sydney lied, her voice trembling. Billy's hand moved from the shelf to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her head back slightly, forcing her to look at him. Let them watch, he murmured, his face inches from hers. Let them see that you belong to me. Not to the ghost. Not to the town. Me. He kissed her then, not a gentle kiss, but a deep, invasive one that tasted of desperation and salt. It was a kiss that felt like a claim, a seal on a contract she wasn't sure she wanted to sign. In the soap opera of Woodsboro, the lines between love and violence were no longer blurred, they were being erased entirely. As Billy pulled away, leaving her breathless and reeling, Sydney noticed Stu Macker standing at the end of the aisle. He was leaning against a stack of books, a playful, vacant grin on his face, but his eyes were sharp, darting between Sydney and Billy with a terrifyingly lucid intelligence. He didn't say a word, he just winked and vanished back into the shadows. Suspicion had become a physical sensation, a lingering itch beneath the skin. Sydney realized with a jolt of terror that the seduction wasn't just Billy's, it was the killer's. And she was falling for it. The Macker estate sat on the outskirts of Woodsboro like a Gothic cathedral reimagined by a teenager with a death wish. Massive, sprawling, and perpetually cloaked in a low-hanging fog, it was the perfect stage for the town's collective denial. Tonight, the tragedy of Casey Becker was being drowned out by high-octane bass, the scent of cheap beer, and the frantic, desperate energy of 100 teenagers trying to prove they weren't afraid of the dark. Inside, the atmosphere was thick, a literal heat generated by bodies pressed together in the dim, strobe-lit hallways. Music pulsed through the floorboards, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to synchronize with the anxiety thrumming in Sydney's veins. She moved through the crowd, feeling the friction of skin against skin, the air heavy with the smell of sweat, perfume, and the metallic tang of fear. In this soap opera of carnage, the party was the masquerade ball before the fall. Stu Macker was in his element, the ultimate master of ceremonies. He was everywhere at once, a blurred figure of manic energy, his laughter echoing a pitch too high, his hands a little too tactile as he draped his arms around friends and strangers alike. He caught Sydney's eye across the living room and raised a red plastic cup in a mock toast, his grin wide and hollow. He looked like a man who knew a punchline that no one else had heard yet. Sydney, you made it. Stu shouted over the music, weaving through the throng to reach her. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of bourbon. I thought you might stay locked in your tower. But look at you, the belle of the bloodbath. Where's Billy, Stu? Sydney asked, her voice tight. She felt exposed in the middle of the revelry, as if every person dancing was a potential shadow with a knife. Stu's eyes glittered with a strange, mischievous light. Upstairs. He's brooding. You know Billy, he likes his drama served at a simmer. He leaned even closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that cut through the bass. He's waiting for you, Sid. Don't keep the king waiting. Sydney climbed the stairs, the noise of the party beginning to muffle into a dull underwater roar. The second floor was a different world, quiet, shadowed, and smelling of old wood and Billy's distinct heavy scent. She found him in a bedroom at the end of the hall, standing by a window that looked out over the dark expanse of the woods. He didn't turn when she entered. The moonlight caught the sharp profile of his face, making him look like a statue carved from ice. I didn't think you'd come, he said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the small space between them. I didn't think I would either, Sydney replied. She closed the door behind her, the click of the lock sounding like a finality. Billy turned then, his eyes dark and burning with an intensity that made Sydney's knees feel weak. He didn't speak, he simply walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. When he reached her, he didn't grab her. He stood so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, his shadow swallowing hers. "The whole town is dying, Sydney," he whispered, his hand rising to cup her cheek. His skin was warm, a startling contrast to the cold dread she had been carrying. "Everything is falling apart. But right here, right now, there's just this." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. The ambiguity of the moment was a living thing. Was this the comfort of a lover, or the calculated seduction of a predator? Sydney didn't know, and in the heat of the room, she found she no longer cared. She was tired of being the girl who survived. She wanted to be the girl who felt something. She reached up, her fingers trembling as they traced the line of his jaw, then moved into the thick hair at the nape of his neck. Billy let out a ragged breath, a sound that was half groan, half surrender. "Sydney." He breathed against her lips. The transition from fear to desire was a violent one. When they finally kissed, it wasn't the tentative exploration of teenagers, it was a collision. It was desperate, fueled by the knowledge that outside this room, a monster was hunting. Billy's hands were everywhere, hesitant then certain, sliding over the silk of her dress with a possessive urgency. In the suggestive language of their shared trauma, Sydney gave in. She allowed herself to be swept away by the physical reality of him, the weight of his body, the sound of his heart hammering against hers, the way his breath hitched when she pulled him closer. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a surrender that felt like both a sanctuary and a trap. For a few blurred, feverish minutes, the masks were gone. There was only the salt of skin, the tang of copper, and the desperate rhythm of two people trying to outrun the end of the world. But in Woodsboro, intimacy is the ultimate vulnerability. Immediately after the peak of their shared heat, as the room settled into a heavy post-coital silence, Billy sat up. He looked at Sydney, really looked at her, with an expression that shifted from affection to something cold and terrifyingly vacant. "I'll be right back," he whispered, his voice devoid of the warmth it had held moments before. "I need to check on something." He dressed quickly, his movements mechanical. He didn't look back as he slipped out of the door, leaving Sydney alone in the cooling sheets. The silence of the room was suddenly oppressive. Then the phone on the nightstand, a heavy vintage rotary, began to ring. Sydney's heart froze. She reached for the receiver, her hand shaking. "Did you enjoy your performance, Sydney?" the voice whispered. It was Ghostface, but he sounded closer than ever. He sounded satisfied. "You invited him in. You always invite the monster in. Tell me, did it feel like love? Or did it feel like a goodbye?" A scream erupted from downstairs, cutting the line. The party was over. The hunt had begun. The silence that followed the scream from downstairs was more violent than the sound itself. In the master bedroom, the air still carried the fading warmth of Billy's skin and the lingering sweet scent of the candles he had lit, a scent that now felt like the perfume of a funeral parlor. Sydney sat on the edge of the bed, her body still humming with the ghost of the intimacy they had just shared. Her skin felt sensitized, almost raw, the silk of her robe sliding over her shoulders with a friction that made her shudder. She felt like a secret that had finally been told, but the listener was gone. "Billy?" she whispered into the shadows. No answer. The house, once a playground of teenage hedonism, had transformed into a labyrinth of jagged edges. Sydney stepped into the hallway, her bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. Below, the music had cut out, replaced by the low, wet thud of the rain against the glass and the distant frantic sounds of people fleeing into the night. The strobe lights from the living room were still pulsing, casting rhythmic hallucinatory flashes of blue and white up the staircase. She found him at the end of the hall. Billy was slumped against the wall, his white shirt, the one she had unbuttoned only minutes ago, now blooming with a dark, visceral crimson. The sight of it felt like a physical blow to her chest. The man who had just held her with such desperate certainty was now a broken thing, gasping for air. "Billy. Oh God, Billy." Sydney scrambled to his side, her hands hovering over the wound. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, a heat she had mistaken for passion. "Who did this? Where are they?" Billy looked up at her, his dark eyes glazed. A slow, agonizing smile spread across his face, not a smile of pain, but of a terrifying, lucid satisfaction. He didn't look like a victim. He looked like an artist admiring his finest work. "Did you really think it was just love, Sydney?" he rasped. He stood up. The movement was too fluid, too controlled for a dying man. He pulled the shirt away, revealing a shallow, tactical graze, a theatrical flourish designed to elicit the very terror she was currently drowning in. He wiped a smudge of blood from his lip and licked his fingers, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're so easy to touch, Sid," he murmured, stepping into her space, his voice returning to that low melodic baritone that had haunted her dreams. "You're so hungry for someone to fill the holes your mother left behind. I just had to decide which version of me you wanted more, the boy who loves you, or the monster who knows you." Before Sydney could scream, a shadow detached itself from the doorway behind her. Stu Macker stepped forward, his face twisted into a mask of manic glee. He wasn't wearing the Ghostface shroud, but he held the voice changer in his hand like a trophy. He was laughing, a high, breathless sound that grated against the silence. "Surprise, Sydney." Stu chirped, his eyes darting between her and Billy with a feverish intensity. "We had you, didn't we? The bedroom scene? Chef's kiss. Very dramatic. Very soap opera. I almost cried, Billy, I really did." The betrayal was a physical weight, crushing the breath from her lungs. The two men moved in a synchronized, predatory dance, flanking her. The bond between them was palpable, a dark, codependent intimacy that excluded the rest of the world. They looked at each other with a spark of shared triumph that felt more obscene than the violence they had committed. "Why?" Sydney choked out, her back hitting the cold glass of the window. Billy leaned in, his face inches from hers. The scent of him was still there, the musk, the leather, but it was now tainted by the metallic tang of the blood on his hands. "Your mother wasn't a victim, Sydney. She was a catalyst. She destroyed my family with her appetites. She invited the mess in, and then she left us to clean it up." He reached out, his fingers tangling in her hair, pulling her head back with a sharp, possessive jerk. "I didn't just want to kill you. I wanted to see if the Prescott blood ran as hot as they said. I wanted to see if you'd invite the monster into your bed just like she did. And you did." Stu cackled, punching the air. "You're a natural, Sid. The way you looked at him. I thought, man, she's even better at this than Maureen was." Billy's grip softened, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a lingering, terrifying tenderness. "You're destined for this, Sydney. The pain, the betrayal. It's your inheritance. I'm just the one who gets to deliver it." He leaned down, his lips ghosting over hers in a mockery of the kiss they had shared earlier. "You invited me in," he whispered, the words a jagged echo of the killer's phone calls. "You always invite the monster in." In that moment, the ambiguity of the past few days vanished. Billy wasn't a protector, he was the architect of her destruction. And Stu was the chaos he used to build it. They weren't just killers, they were directors, and Sydney was the leading lady in a tragedy they had been writing since the day Maureen Prescott died. As Billy pulled a gleaming hunting knife from the small of his back, the blade catching the strobe light from below, Sydney realized that the whispers were over. The scream was finally here. The kitchen of the Macker house was a sterile, fluorescent-lit contrast to the velvet shadows of the bedroom upstairs. Here, under the harsh hum of the overhead lights, the romance of the night was stripped away, leaving only the copper tang of blood and the frantic, jagged edge of a nervous breakdown. Sydney sat slumped against the industrial-sized refrigerator, her wrists bound with heavy-duty zip ties that bit into her skin with every pulse of her heart. Before her, the soap opera had turned into a snuff film. Billy and Stu were no longer the brooding boyfriend and the class clown, they were twin deities of chaos, and they were performing for an audience of one. "It has to look real, Stu. Deep but not too deep." Billy hissed. He was shirtless now, his lean torso slick with a mixture of sweat and the blood from the theatrical wound he'd given himself earlier. He stood over Stu with a hunting knife, his eyes blown wide, shimmering with a dark, eroticized fever. Stu was leaning against the kitchen island, his chest heaving, a manic giggle bubbling in his throat. "Do me, Billy. Make it look like I fought for my life. I want to be the hero who almost died saving the girl." Sydney watched, her stomach churning, as Billy stepped into Stu's space. The proximity between them was suffocatingly intimate. Billy's hand moved to the back of Stu's neck, pulling him close, while the other hand guided the blade into Stu's shoulder. Stu let out a sharp, aspirated gasp, a sound that was disturbingly close to a moan, as the steel parted his skin. They stayed like that for a moment, forehead to forehead, breathing each other's air in a twisted parody of the embrace Sydney had shared with Billy only an hour ago. "You're a beautiful disaster, Stu," Billy whispered, his voice dripping with a terrifying affection. He pulled the knife back, watched the blood bloom across Stu's skin, and then turned his gaze to Sydney. "Look at him, Sid," Billy said, his voice dropping into that low, seductive register. He walked toward her, the knife dangling from his fingertips. "Look at the sacrifice. This is what true loyalty looks like. Not the tepid, boring love your father gave your mother. This is visceral. This is real." He knelt in front of her, the heat radiating from his body hitting her in waves. He smelled of adrenaline and iron. He used the tip of the blade to lift her chin, forcing her to look into his eyes. "You think I'm the monster? I'm the only one who's ever been honest with you. I showed you the darkness because I knew you'd recognize it. I felt it when we were upstairs, Sydney. The way you held on to me, you weren't just looking for safety. You were looking for a reason to let go." The ambiguity of his words crawled over her skin like a physical touch. Part of her, the part that had been forged in the fire of her mother's death, wanted to scream. But another part, the survivor, began to stir. She saw the way Billy looked at her, not as a victim to be disposed of, but as a masterpiece he was still painting. He wanted her to be like him. He wanted her to embrace the violence as a form of ecstasy. "You're right, Billy," Sydney whispered, her voice cracking but steady. She leaned her head back against the fridge, exposing the line of her throat. "I did feel it." Billy froze, his eyes narrowing. Behind him, Stu stopped his frantic pacing, his head cocking to the side like a curious dog. "I felt how desperate you are," Sydney continued, her gaze locking onto Billy's with a newfound, sharp intensity. "You talk about my mother's appetites, but look at you. You're starving. You're so hungry for her attention that you're killing the only people who actually look at you." She leaned forward, her face inches from his, mimicking the predatory closeness he had used on her all night. "You didn't kill her for your family, Billy. You killed her because she saw through you. Just like I am right now." The shift in the room was instantaneous. The eroticism of Danger Billy had been cultivating suddenly curdled into raw, ugly rage. He snarled, his hand flying up to strike her, but in that split second of emotional instability, Sydney moved. She hadn't been idle while they were staging their wounds. She had found a discarded piece of broken glass from a fallen vase near the fridge. With a grunt of effort, she sliced through the plastic ties, the jagged edge biting into her own palm, but she didn't flinch. The pain was a grounding force. As Billy swung, Sydney dove sideways, her hands free. She didn't run for the door, she ran for the counter where they had left the cellular phone and the voice changer. "Stu, get her!" Billy roared, clutching his shoulder where his own self-inflicted wound was starting to bleed in earnest. Chaos erupted. Stu lunged for her, his movements erratic and clumsy from the blood loss and the adrenaline. Sydney grabbed a heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove and swung it with a primal scream, the metal connecting with the side of Stu's head with a sickening thud. He went down in a heap of tangled limbs and floral print upholstery. Sydney turned to face Billy. He was standing in the center of the kitchen, the knife held low, his chest heaving. He looked at her with a mixture of hatred and a twisted, lingering desire. "You liked the danger, Sydney," he hissed, stepping over Stu's twitching body. "You can't deny it. You're wearing it right now. It looks better on you than that robe ever did." "I don't like the danger, Billy," Sydney said, her voice dropping to a cold, lethal calm. She reached behind her and gripped the handle of a kitchen knife they had overlooked. "I just like the way it feels to end it." The soap opera had reached its climax. The trust was shattered, the desire had become a weapon, and for the first time in her life, Sydney Prescott wasn't waiting for the monster to come to her. She was the one holding the blade. The kitchen was no longer a room, it was a cage. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low-frequency dread, flickering occasionally as the storm outside battered the Macker Estate's power lines. Sydney stood her ground, the heavy kitchen knife in her hand feeling like an extension of her own jagged nerves. Across the island, Billy Loomis watched her, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, animalistic heave. The air between them was thick with a residue of what they had shared upstairs, a ghost of heat, a memory of skin, now curdled into something far more potent. "You look different, Sydney," Billy murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that skipped across the surface of her skin. He didn't move to attack. He began to circle the island, his fingers grazing the marble countertop, leaving a trail of crimson smears. The fear is gone. In its place, there's something much more interesting. Something almost predatory. "It's called clarity, Billy," Sydney replied. She followed his movement, keeping the island between them, her eyes never leaving his. Billy let out a soft, dark chuckle. "Clarity? No. It's an awakening. You can feel it, can't you? That electric hum in your veins? That's not just adrenaline, Sid. That's the Prescott legacy. Your mother didn't just have secrets, she had an appetite for the edge. And so do you. Why do you think you chose me? Out of all the boys in Woodsboro, why the one with the shadow in his eyes?" He stopped circling and leaned across the island, his face inches from hers. The scent of him, that intoxicating blend of leather and musk, was now overwhelmed by the raw metallic scent of his blood. "You didn't want a protector. You wanted someone who could match your darkness. You wanted to be seen, truly seen, and I'm the only one who looked deep enough." The ambiguity of his gaze was a trap. He was trying to pull her back into the soap opera of their romance, to use the intimacy they had shared as a leash. For a heartbeat, Sydney felt the familiar pull, the desire to believe in the lie because the truth was too lonely. But then she looked down at Stu, who was beginning to stir on the floor, his fingers twitching toward a fallen steak knife. The spell broke. "You don't see me, Billy," Sydney hissed, her voice a cold, sharp blade. "You only see a mirror for your own narcissism. You didn't love me. You loved the idea of breaking me." She didn't wait for him to respond. As Stu's hand closed around the handle of the knife on the floor, Sydney grabbed a heavy ceramic canister from the counter and hurled it at Billy. He dodged, but the distraction was enough. She lunged not at Billy, but at Stu, bringing her foot down hard on his wrist. The bone snapped with a sickening wet pop, and Stu let out a high-pitched, aspirated wail. "My hand. You broke my hand, you bitch." Stu shrieked, his manic energy turning into pathetic, shuddering sobs. "Stu, shut up." Billy roared, finally losing his cool, melodic composure. The director was losing control of his scene. He vaulted over the kitchen island with a grace that was terrifyingly fluid, his hunting knife raised. Sydney met him halfway. The collision was visceral, a blur of limbs and heavy breathing. Billy slammed her back against the pantry door, his weight pinning her. It was a dark reflection of the way he had held her in the bedroom, but instead of a caress, there was the cold, biting pressure of a blade against her ribs. "You were destined for this, Sydney." Billy growled into her ear, his breath hot and smelling of copper. "You invited the monster in. You liked the way it felt to be owned by me." Sydney struggled against him, her fingers digging into his wounded shoulder, her nails drawing fresh blood. The pain made Billy gasp, a sound that was disturbingly intimate. They were locked in a lethal embrace, their bodies pressed together in a struggle that felt like a twisted form of intercourse, violent, desperate, and final. "I'm not like you," Sydney wheezed, her hand finding the hilt of the knife she had tucked into her waistband earlier. "Aren't you?" Billy whispered, his eyes searching hers with a desperate dying hope for a shared damnation. "Look at us, Sydney. We're the only two people in this town who are actually alive. Everyone else is just a ghost waiting to happen." He leaned in for one final mocking kiss, his lips brushing hers with a ghost of the passion that had once fooled her. In that moment of proximity, Sydney drove her blade upward. It wasn't a clean, cinematic strike. It was a messy, desperate thrust that found the soft tissue beneath his ribs. Billy's eyes widened, the dark fire in them flickering. He didn't pull away. He leaned into her, his weight becoming a literal burden. "You." He breathed, a bubble of blood forming at the corner of his mouth. "You liked the danger." He slumped against her, his blood soaking into the silk of her robe, warm and heavy. Sydney held him for a second longer than she should have, a final morning acknowledge of the boy he had pretended to be. Then, with a shuddering breath, she pushed him off. Billy Loomis hit the floor with a dull, final thud. Stu, seeing his partner fall, tried to scramble away, his broken hand cradled against his chest. He looked up at Sydney, his face a mask of snot and tears, the spectacle he had craved now a nightmare he couldn't escape. "Sydney, please. It was Billy. He made me do it. He's the crazy one." Sydney looked down at him, her face splattered with blood, her eyes as cold as the storm outside. She didn't say a word. She picked up the voice changer from the floor, clicked it on, and held it to her throat. "The party's over, Stu," the voice whispered, the killer's voice, now her own. "She didn't kill him with the knife." She walked to the television set in the corner of the kitchen, the one that had been playing a loop of classic horror films all night. She gripped the heavy, old-fashioned CRT monitor and, with a strength born of pure, distilled survival, she toppled it onto Stu's head. The glass shattered. The sparks flew. And then, there was only the sound of the rain and the hum of the dying refrigerator. Sydney stood in the center of the carnage, her breathing slowing. The trust was gone. The desire was dead. And the girl who had entered the house that night was buried under the weight of the bodies. 6 weeks had passed since the Macker house had been scrubbed of its sins, yet for Sydney Prescott, the scent of copper and vanilla candles still seemed to linger in the back of her throat. She had moved out of her father's house, finding refuge in a small, sleek apartment on the edge of town, a place of glass, steel, and shadows. It was a fortress of solitude where the final girl could finally stop performing for the cameras and the sympathetic gazes of the townspeople. Woodsboro viewed her as a saint, a survivor of an unspeakable duo of madness. But as Sydney stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in her bedroom, she didn't see a saint. She saw a woman who had been hollowed out and refilled with something darker, something heavier. The moonlight filtered through the sheer curtains, casting long skeletal fingers across her skin. She was wearing a silk slip, black this time, the color of a bruise, and the fabric felt like a cool, sliding caress against her hips. She traced the jagged silver line of the scar on her ribs, the place where Billy's knife had kissed her before she ended him. It wasn't just a mark of survival, it was a souvenir. In the quiet of the night, the soap opera of her life felt like it was shifting into a second act. The eroticism of the danger she had survived hadn't vanished, it had mutated. She found herself remembering not the terror of the kitchen, but the heat of the bedroom. She remembered the way Billy's eyes had searched hers, looking for a reflection of his own void. The most terrifying realization wasn't that he was a monster, it was that, for a few feverish moments, she had loved being the thing he wanted to destroy. She poured a glass of dark red wine, the liquid looking like stagnant blood in the dim light. She moved with a new, hardened grace, her movements no longer frantic or hesitant. She was awake in a way she had never been before. The trauma had stripped away the girl, leaving behind a woman who understood that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford, but power was something she could taste. She sat on the edge of her bed, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her like a physical weight. She thought of her mother, Maureen. She finally understood the appetites the town whispered about. It wasn't about the men, it was about the thrill of being on the edge, of playing with a fire that you knew would eventually consume you. Sydney took a slow sip of the wine, the tartness hitting her tongue, and she smiled, a small, sharp thing that didn't reach her eyes. The clock on the bedside table ticked, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat. Then, the phone rang. In the old days, 6 weeks ago, the sound would have sent her into a cold sweat. Now, she simply watched it. The electronic chirp was a sharp intrusion into her sanctuary. She let it ring. 1, 2, 3. She watched the light on the handset pulse, a tiny glowing beacon in the dark. She felt a strange electric pull toward it, a magnetic attraction to the voice she knew was waiting on the other side. It wasn't fear. It was a dark, seductive curiosity. She wanted to know if the world was done with her, or if the whispers were merely moving into a deeper register. On the 6th ring, she reached out. Her fingers were steady, her touch almost lingering as she lifted the receiver to her ear. She didn't say hello. She didn't breathe a word. She simply waited, the silk of her slip rustling softly as she leaned back against the headboard. Silence stretched across the line, heavy and pregnant with intent. Then, a breath. It was a low rhythmic sound, familiar and yet entirely new. "You're not hiding anymore, Sydney," the voice whispered. It was the same baritone, the same velvet over gravel texture, but there was a new intimacy to it, a recognition of the woman she had become. "The black silk suits you. It matches the color of your heart now." Sydney closed her eyes, a shiver that wasn't entirely unpleasant racing down her spine. The ambiguity of the moment was thick enough to drown in. Was it a copycat? A ghost? Or was it the personification of the darkness she had invited in? "What do you want?" she asked, her voice a low, steady hum that mirrored the killer's tone. "I want to see what you do next," the voice replied, a dark chuckle vibrating through the receiver. "The town thinks you're the victim, but we know the truth, don't we? You didn't just survive the monster. You tasted him. And now you're hungry." Sydney gripped the phone a little tighter, her knuckles turning white. She looked out at the dark Woodsboro skyline, feeling like the queen of a very small, very bloody kingdom. The eroticism of the threat was undeniable. It was a conversation she had been having with herself for weeks, and now, someone was finally answering. "Are you going to try to finish what he started?" she asked, a small, challenging smirk playing on her lips. "He was an amateur, Sydney. He was obsessed with the past," the voice whispered, sounding as if the speaker were standing right behind her, his breath ghosting over the nape of her neck. "I'm interested in the future. I'm interested in the woman who knows how to hold a knife, and how to enjoy the silence that follows." A long pause followed, a silence that felt like a bridge between two worlds. Sydney realized she wasn't afraid. She was ready. The soap opera was over, the real drama was just beginning. "Miss me?" the voice whispered, the words a jagged, intimate caress. Sydney didn't hang up. She didn't scream. She slowly pulled the receiver away from her ear, looked at it for a moment with a cold, knowing smile, and then gently set it back on the cradle. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the street below. A single car sat idling under a flickering streetlight, its headlights cutting through the fog like a pair of predatory eyes. Sydney didn't pull the curtains. She stood there, bathed in the pale ghost light of the moon, and waited for the next act to begin. Cut to black. The moonlight in the city was different than the moonlight in Woodsboro. In the city, it had to fight through the orange haze of street lamps and the neon glow of 24-hour pharmacies, resulting in a bruised, sickly violet hue that crawled across Sydney's bedroom floor. She stood at the window of her penthouse, 30 stories above the pavement, wrapped in a robe of heavy midnight blue velvet. It was a weight she needed. The silk she had worn before felt too much like a second skin, too much like a vulnerability. She was no longer the girl who jumped at the sound of the wind. She was the woman who studied the wind to see which way it was blowing. The phone call from 3 nights ago, the "Miss Me?" that had vibrated in her skull like a low-frequency hum, hadn't been followed by a murder. Not yet. Instead, it had been followed by a series of offerings. On her doorstep, she had found a vintage bottle of the exact Chardonnay Casey Becker had been drinking the night she died. The next night, a bouquet of black dahlias, their petals smelling faintly of the same iron-rich scent that had filled the Macker kitchen. The soap opera of her survival was becoming a high-stakes game of courtship. Sydney walked to the small obsidian table in the center of her room. Resting there was the third gift, a small velvet-lined box. Inside lay a single, exquisite mask. It wasn't the cheap plastic Ghostface mask from the costume shops. This was carved from white Carrara marble, polished to a mirror-like sheen, and scaled to fit her face perfectly. It was heavy, cold, and undeniably erotic in its craftsmanship. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the hollowed-out eyes. She felt a strange electric heat rise in her chest, a sensation she hadn't felt since those feverish moments with Billy in the upstairs bedroom. It was the thrill of being known. The thrill of being hunted by someone who didn't just want her blood, but her soul. "You're watching, aren't you?" she whispered to the empty room. She didn't feel afraid. She felt seen. She moved to the full-length mirror, holding the marble mask against her face. The cold stone against her skin made her nipples harden beneath the velvet of her robe. She closed her eyes, imagining the hands that had carved this, the eyes that had measured the distance between her cheekbones while she slept. The ambiguity of the killer's intent. Was this a threat or a proposal? Was the most intoxicating drug she had ever tasted. The doorbell chimed. Not the aggressive buzz of a delivery man, but a soft, 3-note melody that felt like a caress. Sydney didn't check the security camera. She knew the camera would show nothing but an empty hallway. She walked to the door, her heart hammering a steady rhythmic beat against her ribs, not the frantic pulse of a victim, but the anticipation of a woman meeting a lover. She opened the door. The hallway was empty, save for a single man standing by the elevator. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him like armor, his back to her. He didn't turn around, but she could see the way his shoulders tensed as the door opened. "You're late," Sydney said, her voice a low, smoky vibration that surprised even her. The man turned slowly. He wasn't Billy. He wasn't Stu. He was older, with eyes that looked as if they had seen the birth and death of stars. This was Mark, the lead investigator who had handled her case, the man who had spent hours in darkened interrogation rooms with her, his voice always a fraction too low, his gaze always lingering a second too long on the way she breathed. "I didn't think you'd open the door, Sydney," Mark said. He stepped toward her, his presence filling the hallway with a scent of cedarwood and expensive scotch. "I'm tired of doors being a barrier, Mark," Sydney replied. She stepped back, inviting him in with a tilt of her head. The tension between them was a physical thing, a wire stretched to the breaking point. Mark entered the apartment, his eyes immediately finding the marble mask on the table. He didn't look shocked. He looked appreciative. "He's still calling you, isn't he?" Mark asked, walking over to the mask. He didn't touch it. He stood so close to it that his breath fogged the polished stone. "He's not just calling," Sydney said, leaning against the doorframe, letting the velvet robe slip slightly off one shoulder. "He's communicating. He's telling me that the night at Stu's wasn't an ending. It was an initiation." Mark turned to look at her, his expression a mask of professional concern cracked by a very unprofessional desire. He walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that Sydney could feel the heat of his body. "You should be terrified, Sydney," he whispered, his hand reaching out, his fingers hovering just inches from her throat. "You should be under 24-hour guard. You should be anywhere but here with me, talking about a killer as if he were a poet." "Terrified is boring, Mark," Sydney breathed, her eyes locking onto his. She reached up, her hand closing around his wrist, guiding his fingers until they rested against the pulse point at her neck. "I've done terrified. I've done victim. I want to see what happens when the final girl stops running and starts wanting." Mark didn't pull away. His thumb began to stroke the line of her jaw, a slow, possessive movement that mirrored the way Billy used to touch her. The ambiguity of the moment was agonizing. Was Mark her protector, or was he the one on the other end of the phone? Was he here to save her, or was he here to claim the prize that Billy had failed to keep? "You're playing a dangerous game, Sid," he murmured, his face lowering toward hers. "It's only a game if you're worried about losing," Sydney replied. As his lips brushed hers, a tentative, searching contact that tasted of salt and secrets, the phone on the obsidian table began to ring. They both froze, their breath mingling in the space between them. Sydney didn't pull away from the kiss. She leaned into it, her eyes remaining open, staring at the ringing phone with a look of cold, triumphant hunger. The whispers were no longer outside the door. They were in the room. And Sydney Prescott was the one holding the script. The gala was held at the Viridian Opera House, a sprawling monument to old-world excess and new-world secrets. It was the kind of event where the champagne cost more than a teacher's annual salary, and the gossip was more lethal than a jagged blade. The theme was the unmasking, an irony that wasn't lost on Sydney as she stepped out of the black sedan. She wore a gown of liquid gold that seemed to cling to her curves like a second skin, the back draped low enough to reveal the subtle silver scar on her ribs, a deliberate provocation. She wasn't just attending a fundraiser for victims of violent crime. She was presenting herself as the centerpiece of a psychological exhibition. On her face, she wore the marble mask she had received, held in place by a delicate gold chain. It was heavy, cold, and gave her the appearance of a statue that had decided to walk among the living. Mark followed her, looking every bit the brooding protector in a tailored tuxedo. His hand was firmly planted on the small of her back, his thumb tracing rhythmic circles against the silk of her dress. The touch was possessive, a silent claim to the woman who was currently the most famous survivor in the country. "You're playing a dangerous game tonight, Sydney," Mark murmured, his voice lost in the swell of the orchestra playing a haunting minor key waltz. "Every eye in this room is on you. Half of them want to be you, and the other half are wondering what you look like when you're bleeding." "Let them wonder," Sydney replied, her voice muffled slightly by the stone mask. "It's better than being invisible. Besides, he's here. I can feel him." The ballroom was a sea of masks, porcelain dolls, golden lions, velvet harlequins. It was a voyeur's paradise. As they moved onto the dance floor, Mark pulled her closer than was strictly appropriate for a public setting. His chest was a solid wall against her, and the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and a hint of iron, swirled around her, mingling with the heavy perfume of the lilies decorating the hall. The dance was a slow, deliberate exercise in friction. Mark led with a disciplined intensity, his eyes locked onto the slits of her marble mask. Every turn brought their bodies into sharp contact, the heat of his thighs against hers, the way his fingers dug slightly into her waist as he dipped her. The ambiguity of the moment was intoxicating. Was this the embrace of a man who loved her, or the rehearsal of a man who was planning his next move? "You're trembling," Mark whispered, his lips grazing the cold marble near her ear. "Is it fear or something else?" Sydney challenged, her breath hitching as he pulled her flush against his tuxedo. Before he could answer, a server in a featureless white mask glided past, offering a tray of crystal flutes. On the tray, tucked beneath a napkin, was a single blood-red envelope with Sydney's name written in an elegant flowing script. Sydney took the envelope, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She didn't open it on the dance floor. She waited until the waltz ended and she had retreated to the velvet-curtained privacy of the Opera House library, a room filled with the scent of old leather and dust. Mark followed her, the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind them, sealing out the noise of the gala. "Open it," he commanded, his voice dark and demanding. Sydney tore the wax seal. Inside was a single photograph. It was a shot of her from only moments ago, dancing with Mark. But the angle was impossible. It was taken from directly above them, from the rafters of the Opera House. On the back, written in the same low melodic baritone of the voice on the phone, "He holds you like a trophy. I hold you like a prayer. Tell me, Sydney, who is the one truly worshipping you?" The air in the library suddenly felt thin. Sydney felt the weight of the marble mask, the coldness of the stone seeping into her skin. She looked at Mark, who was watching her with an intensity that felt less like protection and more like hunger. "He's watching us," she whispered, the photo fluttering to the floor. Mark stepped toward her, his shadow stretching across the rows of ancient books. He didn't look at the photo. He looked at her. He reached out and slowly, almost reverently, unhooked the gold chain of her mask. As the marble fell away, Sydney felt a rush of cold air against her heated skin. He didn't speak. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with a possessive, trembling certainty. The kiss that followed was a collision, not of romance, but of shared trauma and a desperate, dark need to feel alive. It was rough, invasive, and tasted of the wine they had been drinking. Mark pushed her back against the mahogany shelves, the spines of the books pressing into her back as his hands moved with an urgent, searching rhythm. In the suggestive shadows of the library, the lines between the hunter and the hunted dissolved. Sydney leaned into the danger, her hands tangling in his hair, pulling him closer as if trying to merge their very heartbeats. Was she seeking safety in him, or was she surrendering to the monster she suspected he might be? As the tension between them reached a breaking point, the library's intercom crackled to life. It wasn't the voice of the gala host. It was a low, melodic whisper that seemed to come from the very walls. "Three's a crowd, don't you think?" Mark pulled back, his eyes darting to the speakers. But Sydney didn't look away from him. She saw the flicker of something in his gaze, not surprise, but a fleeting, terrifying look of recognition. "He's closer than you think, Sydney," Mark whispered, his voice now a mirror of the one on the speakers. He stepped back, leaving her cold and gasping in the shadows of the books. The door to the library swung open, and the light from the ballroom flooded in, revealing a figure standing in the hallway, wearing the classic white mask and a tuxedo of his own. The masquerade was no longer a game. It was a war. The air atop the Viridian Opera House clock tower was thin, freezing, and tasted of ozone and ancient rust. The golden gown Sydney wore was now a shimmering burden, the silk whipping around her legs like a frantic golden flame in the gale-force winds of the storm. Below her, the city was a tapestry of blurred lights. Above her, the massive blackened gears of the clock turned with a slow, grinding inevitability, a mechanical heartbeat for a town that refused to stop bleeding. She wasn't alone. She could feel the heat of another presence before she heard him. "It's a long way down, Sydney," Mark's voice cut through the roar of the wind. He was standing by the massive brass bell, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt dampened by the mist and clinging to the muscular contours of his shoulders. His gun wasn't drawn. Instead, he was holding the marble mask she had dropped in the library. He looked at it with a strange, mournful reverence. "Is this where it ends, Mark? Or is this where you show me the man behind the badge?" Sydney's voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the trembling of her limbs. She stepped closer to the edge, the height calling to the part of her that had grown tired of the game. Mark moved toward her, his footsteps heavy on the iron grating. When he reached her, he didn't pull her back from the edge. He stepped into her space, his body a solid, warm barrier between her and the abyss. He held the mask up to her face, his fingers grazing her temples. The proximity was electric, a familiar, agonizing tension that felt like a match being struck in a room full of gasoline. "The man behind the badge has been gone since the first night I stepped into your house, Sydney," Mark whispered, leaning in until his forehead rested against hers. The scent of him, sandalwood and the cold metallic tang of the storm, filled her senses. "You think Billy was the only one who saw the darkness in you? I've watched you for a year. I've seen the way you look at the crime scene photos. You don't look at them with horror. You look at them with recognition." He slid his hand down to the nape of her neck, his thumb tracing the base of her skull with a possessive, rhythmic pressure. "I didn't come here to arrest a killer. I came here to find my equal." The ambiguity was a suffocating weight. Was he confessing to being her stalker, or was he merely admitting to a shared, twisted soul? Before she could answer, a shadow detached itself from the machinery behind the gears. The ghost face of the gala stepped forward. But the movement was wrong, too fluid, too silent. This wasn't the manic energy of Stu or the calculated rage of Billy. This was something spectral. The detective and the debutante, the voice sang out, the same melodic baritone whisper from the phone, now amplified by the acoustics of the tower. A match made in a shallow grave. The figure pulled off the mask. Sydney's breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't a stranger. It was a face she hadn't seen in years, one that shouldn't be here. It was a face that mirrored her own, yet distorted by a lifetime of resentment. "You always did like the boys who were bad for you, Sydney," the newcomer said, a dark smirk playing on their lips. The revelation was a psychological explosion, but the drama was far from over. Mark didn't move to intercept the killer. He stayed locked in his embrace with Sydney, his grip on her neck tightening slightly, not in a choke but in a claim. "Which one of us do you trust, Sydney?" Mark murmured against her lips, his voice a low, seductive challenge. "The one who wants to end the story, or the one who wants to write the next chapter with you?" The tower was a stage for a three-way dance of lust, death, and betrayal. The sexual elements were no longer just subtext, they were the very air they breathed. The way Mark's body pressed against hers, the way the killer watched them with a voyeuristic intensity, the way the wind tore at their clothes, it was a sensory overload of the forbidden. Sydney looked from Mark's burning, desperate eyes to the cold, lethal gaze of the killer. She realized then that she wasn't the prize. She was the master of ceremonies. "Neither," Sydney whispered. With a strength that seemed to come from the very iron of the tower, she shoved Mark back. In the same motion, she reached into the folds of her golden gown and pulled out the small decorative dagger she had taken from the gala centerpiece. She didn't run. She stood in the center of the clock tower, the gears grinding behind her, the marble mask now discarded on the floor. She looked at the two men, the two monsters who had tried to define her, and she laughed. It wasn't a scream. It was a sound of liberation. "You both think you know what I want," Sydney said, her voice rising above the storm. "You think I want love, or revenge, or a legacy. But you're wrong." She stepped toward the edge of the tower, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "I just want to be the one who hangs up the phone." She turned the dagger not on them, but on the massive cable that held the clock's counterweight. With a single, desperate strike, the cable snapped. The gears shrieked in a cacophony of dying metal, and the tower began to shake. In the chaos, the lines between predator and prey vanished. The whispers were finally drowned out by the sound of the world breaking. Sydney didn't stay to see who survived. As the first light of dawn began to break through the storm clouds, she stepped into the service elevator, her golden gown torn, her face splattered with the cold rain. She walked out of the Viridian Opera House and into the morning air. Her phone vibrated in her hand. She didn't look at the screen. She walked to the edge of the harbor and tossed the device into the dark, churning water. The call was finally over.